the British foreign officers themselves are saying, we don't really want a pact with Russia.
Was it inevitable it was going to break down at some point because of Hitler's various ideological gripes with the Soviet Union?
I suppose we should be careful of saying that anything is inevitable in this scenario.
You've got a situation here between the Germans and the Soviets, similar to the one at the end of the Second World War, which then evolves into the Cold War.
Yeah, but Joseph Stalin kind of buys it. He sort of trusts Adolf Hitler, does he not?
No, he doesn't.
There's a very common misconception that portrays the Soviet justification for the pact as essentially defensive, which I think is incorrect.
Ribbentrop continues to bash away at Molotov about how Britain's finished, how they need to reinforce the relationship. Molotov says, look, can I just ask one simple question? He said, who's bombing us right now?
It's the year 1939 and Europe is on the brink of another devastating war. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler has set its sights on territorial expansion, while the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, seeks to secure its own strategic interests. As tensions mount, the two totalitarian powers strike a shocking deal, one that will reshape the course of history. On the 23rd of August, in Moscow, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Officially a non-aggression treaty, its secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, setting the stage for the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of the Second World War. James Hansen, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a diplomatic bombshell that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe on the eve of World War II. This agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union set the stage for the invasion of Poland and the division of Eastern Europe. Yet, had Hitler never betrayed Stalin, breaking the pact, and Germany and the USSR remained allies, how different might the course and outcome of the war have been? Would the United States have ever entered the war? And would Europe have remained divided between the Nazis and the Soviet Union until today? Well, these are questions for our experts, and joining me, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Joining us for the first time on History Undone is historian and author Roger Moorhouse. Welcome to you both. Now, in front of us here we have our big map of continental Europe as it would have been towards the beginning of the Second World War, 1940 really, if you're looking at the precise borders. And of course, let's start by talking about the sort of circumstances that led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Roger Moorhouse, welcome to History Undone.
Thank you.
If you're Adolf Hitler in 1939, why would you want to do a deal of some kind with Stalin?
Stalin's sort of presence in Eastern Europe is a problem for Hitler in the way because he's an unknown quantity. So there's no great love between the two regimes, of course. They've spent most of the previous sort of 10 years and beyond, as Stalin put it, pouring buckets of muck on one another. He mentioned that phrase in the negotiations. So they both sort of saw each other, just to a large extent as the devil incarnate and the sort of, the very antithesis of how they saw themselves. So this is certainly no love match. It's a tactical arrangement in 1939. But for Hitler, it gives him effectively a free hand over Poland. If you remember, the British and the French, we've got this crisis brewing over Poland. Hitler, through the spring and summer of 1939, had basically tried the same sort of saber-rattling techniques that had worked so well over Czechoslovakia the previous year, in the hope that something would give, that the Western powers would intervene, that they would force the Poles to submit, to allow sort of the access to across the Polish corridor to East Prussia, all of the sort of the small stuff that he was requesting or demanding, and in the process Poland could be emasculated in the same way as Czechoslovakia had been emasculated the year before. The problem was in Western capitals, in London and Paris, the sort of the impulse behind appeasement had gone by the spring and summer of 1939. Yeah. So there was no will to do that. Rather, it's the opposite. The British and the French are sort of bolstering the Poles and saying, well, if you're going to stand firm, we're going to stand behind you. So this changes the strategic gamble as far as Hitler's concerned. So one of his ideas is essentially to neutralise the Soviets, so that the Soviets can't be brought on board. British and the French had sent a couple of admirals in the summer of 1939 on a slow boat up the Baltic to go and have talks with the Soviets, with an idea to trying to bring them in on the Allied side, bolstering the Poles to try and sort of forestall a German attack. That was never really going to work, but it worked in the sense that it put the wind up the Germans. As a consequence, Hitler sort of looks at that scenario and says, well, what can I offer the Soviets? What can I give them that would keep them quiet and keep them out of this coming conflict, so that, in a sense, I can have a free hand? And the short answer to that is everything that's included in that Nazi-Soviet pact, which is a very sweetheart economic deal between the two of them. Essentially finished goods and especially military goods from the Germans in return for raw materials. Territory, so for the Soviets, they want back all of that territory, essentially the territory that they'd lost at the end of the First World War, the Baltic states, eastern Poland, territories from what had become Greater Romania in the meantime. So they get that territorial deal, and they get, from a Soviet perspective, they get a free hand. They are then neutral, effectively, in any coming conflict, and that to Stalin is hugely significant.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Chris Parry, always great to have you on the channel. From Stalin's perspective, I suppose this is the bigger question. You can understand why Hitler would want to kind of neutralise the Soviet Union in 1939, but why does Stalin go for a deal?
Well, after Munich, he's pretty disappointed in France and Britain. He also knows that Britain is negotiating with Hitler for a pact as well at the time, because he's got, obviously, the spies, the Cambridge Five, Cairncross and people like that telling him that that's the case. And so he's pretty suspicious. The British foreign officers themselves are saying, we don't really want a pact with Russia. We want to neutralise Hitler here. The other problem, of course, is that Britain and France are seeking to defend a territory that both Germany and Russia want. And what happens is that the Russian ambassador to France says to the foreign minister, look, whatever happens here, Germany is going to invade, whether we have a treaty with them or not, and it will be divided. He actually says that. And with regard to other Russian ambitions here in the Baltics, even Churchill says to Maisky, the ambassador in London, well, that's a sphere of interest for Russia. It's not really anything to do with us at this point. So they're picking up hints, actually, that we're not really interested in an alliance with Russia. And as I said, he's very disappointed over what's happened over Czechoslovakia. Remember, he's weak. He's purged his army massively. The material state of his army and his navy is way low at the moment. He knows he can't take on the Germans. If there's going to be an invasion of Poland anyway, we might as well go along with it and get what we can. And be in no doubt, even if we hadn't had the pact, Germany would still have invaded Poland.
Yes, and I suppose that the key thing is it buys the Soviet Union some time, it allows them to rearm and space, and be in a far better position for what ends up being, of course, a war with Germany. But the interesting thing is...
Can I just come in on that?
Yeah, of course.
Because I think there's a very common misconception that portrays the Soviet justification for the pact as essentially defensive, which I think is incorrect. If you look at what the Soviets are saying to themselves in 39 and even into 40, it's a much more offensive mentality that they have, and it's much more actually governed by ideology. So you've got, in terms of justifications from the Soviets, you've got territorial, which we mentioned, they get some territory back. You've got that economic deal with the Germans. That is obviously hugely beneficial. They're trying to rapidly industrialise. That's what Stalin's been doing for the previous 10 years. So they see assistance in the next phase of that industrialisation drive using German technology and German methods and so on. So that's beneficial. But then the ideological element, and you're right, Chris, when you say the Red Army is weak at this point. It's just come out of the purges and so on. So there's an awareness that the Red Army is weak. It takes a long time, for example, for the Red Army to subdue Finland in November, December, and January of 1939 to 40.
And Roger, don't forget, during this time, they're engaged in a massive war with Japan in the east.
Yeah.
It's actually going on. There are millions of people engaged here. So they've got that distraction to the east. The other thing is, we always think of it in terms of land. The Baltic is the big issue for Russia at this point. As you say, Roger, they're engaged in trying to neutralise Finland. They've got their eyes on the Baltic republics here. And indeed, it's Estonia and Latvia who make the first treaty with Germany before ever Russia does to try and protect themselves. The other thing that appears in the early stages is the Russians want Denmark. Actually say they want Denmark, so they can control the entrance to the Baltic. This is an absolute obsession, along with the Black Sea for the Soviets. And the Germans, of course, say, well, hang on, just a minute, if you have Denmark, the Baltic Sea is actually quite important to us as well, not least because that's where all our submarines train. And so there's a bit of a tension here in the negotiations. But you're right, Roger, there is an expansionist element, and they want to get it without military action. That's the key point, because they are distracted in Finland, they are distracted in the east, and if they can get this by any sort of negotiation, that's fine, because the Germans will actually do it for them.
And there's a last point I was going to come to where I'm sort of talking about it being much more offensively minded than defensively minded from a Soviet perspective. The Soviets kind of don't view the Germans as necessarily bad and the British and the French as being slightly less bad. The outside world is universally bad, universally, an enemy as far as Moscow is concerned. So there are no sort of shades of grey in that. Actually, Germany, because it's already lapsed into fascism, is actually seen as being further down the road to collapse, to inevitable collapse, because it is inevitable as far as Marxism, Leninism is concerned, than the imperialists are. So actually, you're sort of helping the process along, actually by helping the Germans, bizarrely. But there are internal conversations in the Kremlin in 1939, 1940, where they envisage the future, which is that they're using the Germans effectively as a battering ram, because they're allowing the Germans to turn west, to take on potentially, again this is potentially from the perspective of August 39, potentially take on the British and the French again. All of the mentality, all of the thinking in August of 39 is that any war that happens in the West is going to be a rerun of the First World War. It will take years. It will be bloody. It will be like the trench warfare again. From the Soviet perspective, this is a war that they can stay out of, right? It bleeds the Western powers white, the imperialists. It bleeds the Germans white, and the end of which, and they talk about this in the internal discussions, we can roll westwards with our reinvigorated Red Army and take over the whole of Europe. Spreading communism is what they're all about. And they see this as a way of doing it.
And of course, crucially, what they haven't factored in there is the fact that really Adolf Hitler has no intention of observing this pact for longer than he needs to. But Joseph Stalin kind of buys it. He sort of trusts Adolf Hitler, does he not?
No, he doesn't. Roger's right. He's trying to buy time so he can rearm and also get in a position to be able to counter this. He thinks he's got more time than he has. You're absolutely right, Roger. He thinks that the West will be a rerun of the First World War and he'll be able to take pickings out of that, to tell you the truth. He's in no doubt. He's read Mein Kampf. He knows exactly what's in it. And that doesn't just include Poland, that includes this space up to the Urals as well. Everything in Mein Kampf shouts at you that this is going to happen.
But when it happened, he didn't believe it at first, did he? When Barbarossa was launched?
Well, he either didn't believe it or affected not to believe it, because obviously he'd been caught on the hop. The fact of life is that if you look at this area here, which was the bit the Germans had gone through at that point, there's an initial hint that he thinks they're just getting the rest of Poland. He doesn't think that they're coming into the Soviet Union. And that's the key point that quite a lot of historians miss, is they go, OK, we can afford to give that up. We're not ready, and we'll let him have that for now.
And Roger, just on the pact itself, of course, named after Molotov and Ribbentrop, the respective foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. When that is signed, if you're sitting in London or Paris, presumably that sends absolute shockwaves through what become the Allies.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. There's actually a British intelligence assessment, I think it's the week before the pact, in which the conclusion says, well, there's no real prospect of any sort of rapprochement between Moscow and Berlin. A week later, they're signing a pact between them. So it was very much a surprise, even to the intelligence community. What's interesting is that it was a massive surprise to Western European communists, who had spent most of their lives and careers raging against fascism or the threat of fascism. And then lo and behold, their godhead in Moscow goes and signs a treaty with the fascists, the arch-fascists. There are suicides, for example, amongst French communists because of the shock of the Nazi-Soviet pact. That's how big it was. So absolutely, Western capitals are really caught on the hop by this.
And the guarantee to Poland, of course, is now valueless.
Yeah.
If you did it within the context of Russia being hostile to Germany, then everything now is off the table.
And Chris, do you want to talk briefly about how the pact comes to an end? I mean, it's 1941, it is the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler turns his attentions east.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot before that, oddly enough, because there's alternative strategies here. Now, if you look at the difference between the army and the navy in Germany after the fall of France. Now, originally, Ribbentrop, who actually doesn't get enough credit for this pact, I have to say, everybody thinks it comes from the top. Ribbentrop actually says, look, what we need to do, if we defeat France, we need to incorporate all this into a central economic bloc here, using the resources, because we're going to have to take on Britain and maybe the United States. And Hitler says, yeah, before we go against the Soviet Union. He actually says that. This goes on. And quite a number of people, particularly in the Navy, are saying, look, there's an alternative strategy here. You do not have to go through here to bring Russia to its knees. And Admiral Raeder, who has a considerable academic and intellectual reputation for saying, look, there's something more important than Europe here. There's a global issue going on. And if we're going to take on Britain, we have to adopt that. He says, don't go through here. Let's go through the Mediterranean. And he says, we'll take Gibraltar, we'll take Malta, and we'll get Mussolini and Pétain and Franco involved. If we dominate the Mediterranean, we don't have to come this way, we can go this way. And throughout the period between July 1940 and December, there is a constant discussion between Raeder, the army generals who know which side their bread's buttered. We know Hitler really wants to go here. And Hitler also says, look, every time I go to sea, I get seasick. I'm really not interested in this. But he is attracted, and he spends quite a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on between Mussolini, Franco and Pétain to say, what about this Mediterranean strategy? And, when we get to the what ifs, this is a really important point, because if you actually take on the French colonies here, you're successful in North Africa, you take the Suez Canal, you've then got the opportunity to take the oil fields down here in the Middle East, now what is Iraq and Iran, and if you come up this way, you can threaten Russia and its oil fields.
Well, that is a fascinating counterfactual. I'm sure we'll come on to that.
So that goes on. It's a very serious discussion. Raeder thinks he's got Hitler's attention on this one. He's certainly got the attention of some of the Luftwaffe people as well. But the army generals, as I said, know what the ideology is.
Yeah.
We're going to go for Lebensraum, and we're going to go for it as quickly as possible through Poland.
And that is the key point, isn't it? If you're Adolf Hitler, at some point you want to turn your attentions east. A, because you've got this pathological hatred of Bolshevism. You want Lebensraum, you want living room for the German people, and you want the natural resources to fund your war effort.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's Hitler's obsession. He's absolutely, as Chris says, he's absolutely land-based. He has a sort of curious myopia about naval warfare, actually, all the way through the war. So he's very much land-based. This is something that Dönitz complained about an awful lot, in terms of begging for resources for the U-boat arm, which was the only really effective arm of the naval war for Germany. But Hitler's resolute about it being a continental war. One aspect that I wanted to bring in terms of German thinking behind the pact, is that rather than that sort of frontal assault that we know happened in the summer of 1941, there is a school of thought within Germany which, for all the reasons we just mentioned, doesn't really get that much traction, but is nonetheless quite persuasive in explaining the logic behind the pact, which is that if you create the environment with all of those economic relationships and mutual benefits involved that we've talked about, then you're in a situation, from Germany's perspective, where you can effectively, I think the phrase was used, you can effectively milk the Soviet Union to such a degree that you can effectively, make it your sort of colony, make it your satrap.
This is like China today with Russia. China calls Russia its gas station.
Yeah.
Similar.
The same mentality.
Use the mineral resources, use everything else.
Yeah.
And so Russia's always been, if you like, the victim of that sort of behaviour.
Yeah. So they perceived the Soviet regime as being inherently weak, first of all. So they thought if you can get your claws into that economically, you can milk it, you can get all the economic benefit, crucially that oil and grain and everything else that, in the event of a wider war, Germany's going to need. And at the same time, you've got this sort of satrap colony that, the communism will collapse. You might not even need to invade it in due course.
I mean, Ribbentrop quite clearly says, when he's justifying this sort of approach, in the 2 weeks it takes to actually do it, he actually says, look, if we can get Russia on side, we deal with France and we bring all this together with Italy, we've got this fantastic economic union here that we can then take on the Brits and the Americans. They actually mention the Americans as needing, and that's why afterwards they want to go and get the Canary Islands. That's part of their strategy in all of this. So Ribbentrop, who, as I've said, gets a really bad press all round, in this actually has a real vision for being able to do this. But, as I said, it's only a stepping stone. Do that, then we'll do the Soviet Union afterwards.
So much to discuss. Before we dive into the consequences of Hitler's deception, let's just break down the sheer scale of Germany's 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. The Axis unleashed about 3.5 million troops, 148 divisions, 80% of the entire German army, backed by around 3,400 tanks, 2,700 aircraft and 7,000 artillery pieces. Despite early victories, they suffered 1 million casualties, including 186,452 killed. On the Soviet side, up to 5.5 million troops stood ready, with 14 million more in reserve, supported by a vast arsenal of 23,000 tanks, 9,000 aircraft and 33,000 artillery pieces. But the opening months were catastrophic. Soviet losses soared to 4 million, with over 500,000 killed and 3.3 million taken prisoner. And this was total war on an unimaginable scale, and it was only the beginning. So that is the real history of what happened after the pact broke down. I suppose the key question now is, well, did the pact have to break down? Roger, was it inevitable it was going to break down at some point because of Hitler's various ideological gripes with the Soviet Union?
I suppose we should be careful of saying that anything is inevitable in this scenario. I think if we're going to put a percentage on it, I'd probably put this percentage quite high, up about sort of 75, 80% that it would break down because of Hitler's territorial obsessions and his obsession with Lebensraum and all of that stuff.
And race.
And race, of course, absolutely. So, that rather tips the balance in favour of an outright attack. Also, at the same time, he has proven himself, in his own mind at least, but also in others as well, a very adept military leader, military commander. The invasion of Poland goes pretty much to plan. The invasion of France is spectacular. And of course, all the way through, his generals are very often saying, "Oh, just slow down. You don't want to, let's just be a bit more cautious and a bit more conservative." And he sort of blows them all out of the water with this supposed tactical genius. So, of course, if he's saying now, right, we're going to go and attack the Soviet Union headlong, there are going to be few voices of caution that are actually going to be able to contradict him. So, in that sense, I think, I wouldn't say inevitable, but it's very, very likely. There were other scenarios on the table, like we described, but I think it's very, very likely.
But, Chris, with the benefit of historical hindsight, is this not the moment Adolf Hitler loses the war?
Well, I agree with Roger. Adolf Hitler is a fantastic strategic commander until he isn't. I mean, that's the key point. It's all determined by success, of course. Interesting enough, I think there are a lot of other factors involved, actually. This is one element, but declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor is pretty catastrophic.
Bit of a blunder, yeah.
Because that actually supplies the Soviet Union with quite a lot of its war material. It brings in, the world's superpower. There's no question in terms of industrial capacity.
Yeah. And there was arguably no strategic need for him to do that.
Well, it's a tripartite pact. He was so locked into that, and he thought that if he didn't honour it, then the others wouldn't honour it, the Japanese, for example. The Italian relationship with Germany was always a bit shaky, even though the personal relationship between Hitler and Mussolini was incredibly close. I mean, very close indeed. And of course, Italy is the origin of the fascist sort of ideology.
And incidentally, Italy and Mussolini had cried foul about the Nazi-Soviet pact.
Yes,
they were absolutely adamant that was a bad move.
Oh yeah, and couldn't see it either ideologically or indeed strategically. But yeah, I mean, so if we've been discussing now if Hitler had been successful, if his double encirclement north and south had succeeded, he'd still be a brilliant soldier, wouldn't he? And I have to tell you, that is the view of a lot of German military historians.
And you kind of agree. You think there is a scenario in which militarily you could have made a form of Barbarossa work.
I think your chances are better. I mean, Napoleon knows. You can suck up huge armies in this space. People always forget how big this space is. But if Germany had gone with the original plan, which was essentially an army group south and north, which then would have encircled Moscow there. Now, the German General Staff always worried about their flanks, whether it's the First or Second World War, they're obsessed about their flanks. And certainly, if you've got a fast-moving army with its horses and its part mechanisation, then you are going to be worried about your flanks. And so what the German army staff do is say, look, we need an army group centre. And Halder in particular leads the charge on this. So they strip out these two flanking armies and they form this third one. My own view is they'd have stood a better chance if they hadn't actually had this drive for Moscow with this centre group and kept these two strong. It would have led to, as I say, a double encirclement, and smashing victories would have led, I think, to an early withdrawal, if not a complete collapse of the regime.
Roger, what do you make of that? Are you sceptical of that, or?
I think it was quite possible that they could have forced the communist regime to fall, to collapse. One crucial factor we haven't mentioned, of course, is the Yugoslav question. So that sort of fatally delays Barbarossa. And as we know, you get the Germans are outside Moscow in December and essentially are snowbound. You've got fresh, Siberian troops come in. In a sense, that's one of the great turning points of the war. If you could, wind that back by a month, if you took Yugoslavia out of the equation and they could have attacked a month earlier, that gives them another month of half decent weather in which to try and take Moscow. In the circumstances, I could see a scenario where the regime falls, the communist regime falls, but I don't see that that's necessarily the end of the conflict on the Eastern Front. I think you're then left with, rather bloody and rather brutal partisan warfare because of the sort of racist and ideological obsessions of the Germans. Winning a peace in that scenario is extremely, extremely difficult, if not impossible. So you still lose a large number of men, and the Eastern Front is never going to be quiet.
But you then become an occupation army. Yeah. There are no major forces. You can take quite a lot of divisions to the west again. Yeah. And the prospects for Britain. When Hitler turns towards Barbarossa, he actually says, once we take Russia out, Britain will surrender because there's no hope. He doesn't consider the United States at that point. I mean, one thing that people don't recognise is the considerable obsession that Hitler has with the United States as well. He thinks he's going to have to fight the United States at some point. He always talks about the number of German Americans who are actually in politics and in the military in the United States. He says, look, we've sent the best of our people over there and we might have to fight them.
But did it not occur to him that if he invades the Soviet Union, if at some point, as indeed happens, the US do get involved, there's a very high chance, as indeed happened, that the US will be allied with the Soviet Union and the British, and that will make his job even harder?
Absolutely, but you're into a war now, as you say, is escalating into total war. He thinks, OK, how long is it going to take the Americans to actually have an impact here? I remember the First World War. It took them nearly 15 months to actually get any troops that were trained on the ground. So I think I can take Russia out first.
OK, so Roger, let's say hypothetically, Adolf Hitler decides in 1941, I'm not ready to break the pact just yet. I need to secure the Western Front. What then happens for the next year or so? Talk me through how you think that next 12 months of the war might have played out.
I think you have... what you have then, de facto, is the creation of a sort of Eurasian bloc essentially under Hitler's control, with Stalin as a sort of junior partner, right?
And this was Ribbentrop's plan. That's the key point.
Yeah.
So, all the way, if we're talking about after the fall of France, you've got all the way from the Atlantic coast effectively to Vladivostok, is one strategically aligned block.
It's
right?
a continental system, just like under Napoleon.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the sort of theatre operation shifts. I think, incidentally, I know we'll come on to it, but I think the Americans still come in because that's sort of
Pearl
contingent
Harbor's
on
probably
the
still gonna
Japanese.
happen.
So Pearl Harbor still happens. The Americans still effectively come in because Hitler can't resist declaring war on the Americans. So that doesn't necessarily change. But I think you see a shift in operations. I think the naval war becomes much more significant from 41 onwards. And I think you might see a shift in operations where the Allies, such as they are, which is now essentially Britain and America and others, obviously with the Empire troops and everything else, but you will see seeking for a soft underbelly to that Eurasian bloc, which is not going to be a landing on Dieppe landing or D-Day. It's going to be somewhere. I suspect Turkey becomes crucial, Persia becomes crucial, arguably Italy as well. But again, I don't think that. I think it actually shifts further east. There's an interesting precursor to this, which is a thing called Operation Pike. Which doesn't get talked about much. It never went into operation, but it was talked about in 1940, prior to the fall of France, and it was an Anglo-French plan for a bombing raid on the Soviet Caucasus oil fields, and the intention was they're already looking at trying to sort of prod this Eurasian bloc, trying to prod the German Soviet bloc at its weakest point, which is to hit it in the south, where there's, they reckon there's not much in the way of defences there. Of course, you're hitting the oil supply, which is crucial to both sides, not least the Germans. So that's seen as the soft underbelly. So I think you would see a shift to a much more sort of Eurasian conflict. Turkey becomes crucial, Persia becomes crucial, even Central Asia. So I think there'll be a shift in operation in the field of operations.
Chris?
Well, you've got to look at what the various military senior officers were saying after the fall of France. I'm going to concentrate on the Navy again. The Naval Operational Staff at this point says, right, every British colony is up for grabs, so are the French right now. And what we haven't mentioned is a thing called Plan Zebra, Plan Z, which is the German Navy's plan, which it would have had if Hitler hadn't have gone to war in 1939. And this talks about 6 super battleships, 2 Bismarck and Tirpitz, and 4 even more powerful battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, large number of heavy cruisers that are designed not only to hold the British in place here in Europe, but also to go out and raid and get colonies. So there's real ambition, and it's almost hysterical the way they say, look, we're going to take over all the British and French colonies as part of the Greater Reich at this point. And this is before Barbarossa. But I must stress this business of actually neutralising the Mediterranean. I am sure that the Germans would have said at this point, got a neutral Spain, we've got Pétain here, we've got Italy here, we've got Greece. We've got long-established relationship with the Turks, even if they don't want to get involved. We can actually take the Mediterranean, and what Roger says is we can push down into the Middle East, we can get the oil fields there. We're not going to need the stuff in Romania or up in the Caucasus. And then, of course, we've got the option, as I said earlier, to sweep up through the Caucasus and actually get to Stalingrad that way, rather than through Ukraine and this, that, and the other. And if you read the original plan by Raeder, it's very seductive. And if Hitler, as you said, Roger, had any inkling for sea power and things like that, you'd have gone, that is a great plan. I mean, it really is a great plan. We would have struggled to counter that. The other problem is he can't get agreement with Mussolini, Pétain and Franco to actually conduct operations. And he's even thinking about saying, right, we're going to take Morocco and we'll go across the strait here to get Gibraltar. And once we've closed Gibraltar, the Brits are nowhere.
Yeah, so it's game over.
Game over. So I think, the soft underbelly for the Allies would have been the Mediterranean, because if that becomes a German lake as well, and they've got the aviation to do that, we are in serious trouble, because we've got to go around the Cape to get to India, and all our sort of communications are pretty much across the Atlantic and across the Pacific that way. It's not sustainable. And of course, you see it in Hitler's sort of writing at this time. That's what Alexander the Great did. He went down that way to India, and threatening India, of course, is like kryptonite for the Brits. So this is a great plan, and Admiral Raeder, Grand Admiral Raeder, is probably one of the most underrated strategic thinkers in World War II.
Well, listen, as we're talking about the Middle East and India and the Pacific theatre, let's zoom out now and let's ask ourselves, if the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had held a bit longer, what would the larger global consequences have been? OK, so we've got a new map in front of us now. This is the official United Nations map of the world's countries as they were at the end of the Second World War in reality in 1945. Roger, to start with you, if we're saying the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact holds, does the outcome of the Second World War look entirely different?
Potentially, yes. You have a Britain which is very, very isolated. You've got that huge Eurasian bloc that we were talking about with almost unlimited raw materials, oil, grain, and the rest of it. So that bloc is well insulated against any sort of economic warfare from the outside world. It's Britain that is then, desperate to get supplies from America and elsewhere, Canada and elsewhere. I think America still comes in. Because that impulse is obviously related to Pearl Harbor, so different theatre. Hitler declares war on the US, which is a strategic requirement of the tripartite alliance. But then he kind of adds another enemy to his list at that point. So that's a sort of strategic, I think, misstep on Hitler's point. I think the Americans still come in for various reasons. They're actively engaged already through 1941, before Hitler's declaration of war. There's a couple of American destroyers that are sunk in the Atlantic, for example, trying to protect convoys against the Germans. So they're already sliding towards active participation in defending the UK and coming into the war. So I think that still happens, but that makes how you actually roll up, how you actually attack that Eurasian bloc is a much more difficult question for the Allied powers. You can't go into Western Europe, I think, because the defences will be too great. We're back to talking about sort of soft underbellies. Economic warfare is not going to work. So all of the trump cards appear to be in the hands of Hitler and Stalin at that point.
So Chris, therefore, do the Americans think, we need to focus first and foremost on just protecting our interests in the Pacific, and maybe if we can negotiate some kind of treaty in Europe with the Soviets and with the Nazis to maybe protect the sovereignty of the UK, maybe they go for that?
Well, I mean, you've got to think, what is the threat to US interests here? So if we dominate the Western Hemisphere, if we're facing the Pacific, that's where quite a lot of our interests are now. Philippines, quite a lot of the islands and things like that. Why do we need to get involved anyway? I mean, I think it's up for debate whether they would actually leave Britain to its own fate, to tell you the truth. There's a very powerful isolationist lobby still booming away. You've got the ambassador saying, well, Britain's finished anyway. Joseph Kennedy, he's saying he's finished. And there's a real worry in the United States. If we pile lots of war material into Britain, if Britain gets captured, then the Germans have got it. And so I don't know. I think it's up for debate. Knowing the Americans' hemispheric emphasis, it may well be, actually, they say, we're going to face the other way. And Britain, I'm afraid, didn't actually do enough to defend itself. We'll take on some of the colonies for you. We'll look after some of your dominions. We certainly will maintain the link with Canada, Australia, and other places, because it's important for us as well.
But mainland Britain, you're on your own.
Well, yeah, but the other thing is you get sucked into this Eurasian.
Well, do you? I mean, does that happen through a kind of Operation Sea Lion invasion, or does that happen because you end up with a kind of Nazi puppet regime?
Blockade.
Yeah.
You just force Britain to submit. I mean, this is where, that sort of rather doomsday scenario that we've just described, this is where you see the significance of individuals, of great men in history, if you like, in Roosevelt and Churchill, because both of them are, to a large extent, sort of defying reality and defying, to some extent, particularly in Roosevelt's example, as Chris just said, you've got this very strong isolationist trend in the US, which we're seeing actually playing out today in real time as well. But very strong trend, and actually, Roosevelt had kind of dragging, the US towards more active involvement, almost single-handedly. So, this is where I think the individuals, and again, for both of them, both Roosevelt and Churchill, they're sort of working on principle. They're saying that this is a principle that we cannot allow, Britain to fall. We cannot allow sort of tyranny to prevail, and so on. Again, with Churchill, he's sort of one of his geniuses is that it's that defying of obvious reality. Because in 1940,
and Hitler can't get that either.
No, he can't understand.
He says, defying gravity and reality.
Yeah.
Here. What's going on here? And indeed, that's part of the strength of the US-UK relationship is that Hitler just cannot get it into his head why. Because he wouldn't think of it like that.
No.
Because it's Darwinian struggle. You're clearly losing. Why don't you give up? You've got good terms.
And so does the Second World War under this scenario end sooner? Does it drag on for longer? Are we looking at it ending around 1945 nonetheless?
In Europe, there's a scenario, but out here, totally different. You've got Japan in Manchuria, driving into China. You've got the Americans, of course, engaged with the Japanese across the Pacific. So everything's focused that way at the moment. So part of the World War actually splits off. It ceases to become a world war in that respect. I think
you effectively lose the European theatre.
Yeah.
That ceases to be.
And in the Pacific theatre, it maybe follows a similar time frame.
You've got the Empire as well. The Empire trying to hold on. Whether Roosevelt and Truman as well are ideologically opposed to the idea of empires. So they might have to take on the stewardship. I mean, of course, it has happened during Lend-Lease, of course. Americans have got access to British colonies and dominions in return for the destroyers and other war material. So it may well be the stewardship of the empire gets taken on by America, particularly in those areas where they're really interested. Now, the problem I've got in my mind is how on earth do you liberate this unless, like today, Roger, as you hinted, you split off the Soviet Union. So American diplomacy at this point is probably saying, you know what, we can be a better friend to you than Germany can. Just as I believe President Trump is saying to Putin right now, we can be a better friend to you than China will.
Do you think that's a viable scenario where, in essence, you end up with the US trying to make overtures to the Soviet Union? And of course, everyone who lived through the latter half of the 20th century, that just seems so anathema to. But do you think that could have happened?
Well, you're saying the Ribbentrop Pact is too
true.
So why wouldn't this work?
Why wouldn't that work?
And bear in mind, as I said before, if you've got that Eurasian bloc, which is a fairly politically, it's a fairly uncomfortable place because you've got two ideologies which are vehemently opposed to one another. There's an exploitative element, both ways, but particularly from the Germans on Soviet raw materials. Stalin is of necessity a lesser partner, becomes a lesser partner in that. So there are going to be tensions, not least strategic. As we mentioned before, the strategic view of the Soviets is always to come west. It's about getting control. They talk about this. A little glimpse of Soviet thinking is largely forgotten episode. November of 1940, Molotov comes to Berlin and they have discussions about what is basically Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact Mark II, the reset. How are we going to take this forward? And Molotov is talking about the Skagerrak and the Kattegat, the mouth of the Baltic. He's talking about the Bosphorus. He's saying these are our strategic targets.
Red lines.
And the Germans are going, no way. That's not on the table. And there's a concerted effort to sort of turn Soviet attention southward to the Raj, and that's where you can have your playground. They talk about Red Army boots, being washed in the Indian Ocean. So there's a very different vision between the two partners as to where Soviet interests lie.
And that's when the Germans finally say we're doing Barbarossa rather than the Mediterranean plan under radar. So during the discussions between Molotov and Ribbentrop, there's a really amusing incident. In the middle of it, there's an air raid warning, and they have to go down into the bunker. And Ribbentrop continues to bash away at Molotov about how Britain's finished, how they need to reinforce the relationship. And Molotov says, look, can I just ask one simple question? He said, who's bombing us right now? And of course, Ribbentrop loses quite a bit of face. And then, of course, the decisions move very rapidly.
But there's a really interesting indication of that sort of differing strategic view between Berlin and Moscow. Right at the end of 1940, that both parties are involved in what's known as the Danubian Commission, which is a very sort of small-scale regional, talking shop about sort of Danube trade routes and keeping the waterway clear and all that sort of thing. It's very kind of parochial. But there are Soviet representatives and there are German representatives there. And in the middle of December 1940, there's a meeting of that body, and they effectively come to blows. The German and the Soviet representatives come to blows. Because the Soviets are talking, they're very ambitious about expanding their control over the Danube and beyond, down the Black Sea coast to the Bosphorus and so on. And the Germans are saying, this is not going to happen. You cannot expand your sphere of influence westward. This is ours. So they literally come to blows in that meeting. And it's actually the day after that episode, which is little known and little reported, that Hitler gives the order for Barbarossa.
I mean, I think what's interesting here is you've got a situation here between the Germans and the Soviets, similar to the one at the end of the Second World War, which then evolves into the Cold War.
Yes.
You've got an expanding Russia. And I have no doubt that at some stage, Russia, the Soviet Union, would have wanted to take on Germany.
So there's going to be a conflict between the two at some point.
They are splittable. So America will be looking for this opportunity. And as I said, if you look what happened, you're ending up probably with a Cold War earlier between Germany, the German bloc, and the Russian bloc.
So it's 1945, you have like three major world powers. You have the US, you have Nazi Germany, and you have the Soviet Union. And the latter two at some point are probably going to...
Well, I think earlier than that, to tell you the truth.
I think earlier than that.
From what Roger says.
It can't last that long, I don't
And,
think.
America, if it's tempting the Soviet Union with supplies and all sorts of trade deals and things like that. I mean, part of the Ribbentrop Pact was a huge loan but from Germany to Russia to actually buy material and resources from Germany.
It looms very. I mean, the economic aspect of it looms very large. There are 4 treaties within that 20-month period. So economics looms very large, and that, as in the scenario described, would be the American key to detaching the Soviet Union.
Yeah. So you detach, just like today. We want Trump, I am sure, is trying to detach Russia away from China at the moment, for much the same reason. But I think you've ended up with a Cold War scenario, possibly leading to a hot war when the Soviet Union was ready to do that. And so the liberation of Europe might have taken place from the east rather than from the east and the west.
With all of the consequences that would have brought with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, the sort of catch-22 of all World War II counterfactuals is the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
If that happens, if that's still, the Manhattan Project progresses as it does, do the bombs still just get dropped on Japan, or is there any scenario in which they might go, well, OK, we've got 2 hostile blocs here in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, we might drop a bomb on either of those?
It might not be a hostile bloc.
Yeah.
America's got a good economic relationship with this bloc, regardless of their moral principles. It may well be their trading. I mean, handling the Soviet Union is the big issue here. Where, at some stage, they're not going to be your allies, even if they are for now. I think we mentioned earlier that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is a classic case of looking after your short-term objectives at the expense of your ideology and your long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And that's how it's worked out. So in all this sort of shifting power relationships, you can't actually tell what's going on. I mean, if the Germans manage to consolidate this European Union, which is what it looks like, that's quite a powerful bloc. I think, you think, Roger, I think the Germans would have had a problem with manpower actually holding down the whole of Europe, because they were very strong. Unless they've massively expanded the Waffen-SS, they've got a problem with manpower.
Yeah.
They've got a lot of slave labour. There's no question about that.
And that again is one of the root problems of any sort of long-term positive scenarios for Nazi Germany is that their racial obsessions mean that you can't draw on Russian manpower, for example, for a military. That's not going to work.
I mean, again, going back to Rader actually says in a conversation with some of the generals who are sort of talking about all this, he actually says, look, we need to look at the Roman example. It wasn't all Roman citizens. He said you had the provincials in as auxiliaries. We need to start thinking about that.
Well, and presumably as well, you'd have nationalist resistance movements, throughout Western Europe, causing headaches for the Nazis all the time.
Yeah, but again, that's rather contingent on how heavy the jackboot is in that particular area. So they're quite good at, in Bohemia, for example, Bohemia and Moravia, they're quite good at having a relatively, there's the mailed fist, but it's relatively light touch.
Same in Norway.
Same in Norway. So, as long as the sort of racial aspect is not sort of front centre and murderous, as it was in Poland, which then, to a large extent, provokes the massive Polish resistance, then actually the Nazis were quite good at actually managing those territories relatively well.
And in fact, if you look at modern repressive regimes after World War II, the problem is if you have a heavy machinery of state pushing down on you, unless there's an external power that is able to assist you and put pressure on the regime, it'll continue forever. That's what's happening in Iran right now. The people are dying to revolt against the regime, but the repressive apparatus is so great. Without external pressure or invasion, for example, or attack, that's never going to happen. So you can hold down the continent. It's just a question of who you use to do it. And we know that quite a lot of, I'm afraid, native populations, quite a proportion of them actually cooperated and actually repressed their own people. I mean, you've only got to look at the divisions in France, the Vichy element and things like that, to see how, to actually survive and live, people do cooperate.
And a lot of the rationale behind, the operations of SOE and so on is not necessarily fostering resistance, but provoking a heavy-handed response, which will then, create discontent in a much more general sense.
But you can't tell how it goes. You see, I mean, we managed the assassination of Heydrich. Again, you mentioned Bohemia. In the old Czech lands, heavy repression, and of course they were quiet after that. So you can't tell. It depends on the local culture and the local balance of strength.
Gents, we could talk about this for hours. Sadly, that is all we've got time for today. But I think we can say that had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact held for longer, it could have fundamentally altered the outcome of the Second World War. It certainly means that Adolf Hitler doesn't have to worry about his Eastern Front, certainly not for the time being. It probably means that even if the US enters the Second World War, which they would to protect their interests in the Pacific, they're far less focused on liberating Western Europe. And as a result, you end up in a situation where probably in 1945 you have mainland Europe dominated by Nazi Germany, you have the Soviet Union emboldened, and you have the US as the other third major power, which means the latter half of the 20th century looks very, very different. You probably get a Cold War of a different kind between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler's ideological hatred of everything that the Soviet Union stood for, plus his desire for Lebensraum, living room for the German people, and the natural resources of Russia and the Soviet Union mean that he probably would have gone to war with them in some way, shape or form at some point, or maybe it would have been the Soviets, backed by the US, provoking a war with Nazi Germany. Conflict in the latter half of the 20th century almost certainly would have happened under this scenario, but what we knew happened at the end of World War II would have been very, very different. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but my thanks to Roger and Chris for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. Don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.